Hello learners and welcome back to the NPTEL course on Victorian literature. As promised, we will continue our discussion of the novel Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and we will wrap up our discussion of this novel in this lecture by continuing to see how the reviews and the reception of the first publication of the novel in Lippincott's monthly magazine produced a range of intellectual and literary forces to which Oscar Wilde responded, and through these responses, the novel evolved in its shape and became received for future readers. I had begun discussing three critical reviews of the novel which appeared in the periodical press of the late Victorian era. The first was in St. James's Gazette, the second was in Daily Chronicle, and the third was in the Scots Observer. As I mentioned, this third review in the Scots Observer went the furthest and drew very strong and insulting connections between the author of the novel and real people who had featured in the news of the times. The review in the Scots Observer mentioned that the novel was very far from a work of art. It was very far from an intellectually edifying piece of writing, and in fact was a document which had only legal or moral value. And it was a document which must be recorded in camera in police investigations. And further, the review in the Scots Observer mentioned that this was a novel that was relevant to perverted messenger boys and outlawed noblemen. And this very specific reference to outlawed noblemen and messenger boys referred to an event, a scandal which had recently unfolded, in which it was discovered that some very wealthy upper-class men had been paying money to poor working-class boys. And in this case, the boys were employed in the postal service and worked in the telegraph office, and the money was given in exchange for some sexual favors. This was the scandal, and by mentioning the scandal, by using the words telegraph boys and outlawed noblemen, the Scots Observer was implying that characters in the novel were doing what was discovered recently to be done by a few elite men in London's West End. And the moment in the novel which might have inspired the Scots Observer to make this kind of an inference is a line that is spoken by Basil Hallward to Dorian Gray. Basil asks Dorian, "Why is your friendship so fatal to young men?" And Basil further describes this fatalistic quality of this friendship by naming a person who had to leave. Basil says, Sir Henry Ashton, who had to leave England with a tarnished name. Of course, this name is fictional, but keen readers, and the reviewer for the Scots Observer was certainly one of those very keen readers and who had an eye and an ear cocked for this kind of connection, would very easily be able to see that this tarnished name and this person who had to leave England was very close to the kind of events that had recently unfolded. Very possibly, the staff at Henley's paper, that is the Scots Observer, had heard rumors that Wilde was intimate with London's homosexual underworld, and they no doubt realized that in the early chapters, Wilde audaciously accentuated Basil Hallward's homoerotic interests. Whether Wilde ever visited Cleveland Street remains unknown, and Cleveland Street is the location where this news was reported and the scandal was discovered and talked about in the newspapers. So there is no factual evidence that connects the author of this novel and the character, the main protagonist of this novel, to that location. However, the kind of writing one sees and the kind of relationship and the kind of language that is used to describe this relationship between a very privileged, wealthy man and others, unnamed people who have to leave England because of tarnished names, because of their reputations which are destroyed when it is discovered that they had a certain kind of relationship with a certain younger male persons. The speculation is that Dorian Gray moved in circles that were not dissimilar to those of the recently disgraced Lord. Now, how did Oscar Wilde respond to this criticism? To the St. James's Gazette, Oscar Wilde replied that he was quite incapable of understanding how any work of art can be criticized from a moral standpoint. That is, Wilde was quite impatient with the newspaper's demand that an artwork should preach wisdom. Instead, Wilde claimed that if his novel contained a moral, it was a very unconventional sort of moral. It was that all excess, as well as all renunciation, brings its own punishment. So you can see in the statement, all excess, as well as all renunciation, brings its own punishment. Even in defending himself, Oscar Wilde was not willing to take a very conventional moralistic stand. The conventional moralistic stand would be to say excess is wrong, restraint or abstention is good. Instead, Oscar Wilde says both excess and renunciation are wrong. So excessive renunciation and excessive indulgence both produce the same kind of punishment or ill effects. Clearly, Oscar Wilde was not doing himself any favors when the prevailing mood and the discourse of the time all aimed to paint Oscar Wilde in the likeness of an adulterer, immoral writer, someone whose writings had the power to corrupt the youth of England and who therefore should not only be not read but maybe also punished. To the second negative reviewer, this is how Oscar Wilde responded. Oscar Wilde explained his process, explained the aesthetic and technical process of writing the novel and how the novel was trying to address a philosophical and aesthetic problem. This is Oscar Wilde replied to the Daily Chronicle. When I first conceived the idea of a young man selling his soul in exchange for eternal youth, an idea that is old in the history of literature, but to which I have given new form, I felt that from an aesthetic point of view, it would be difficult to keep the moral in its proper secondary place. And even now, I do not feel quite sure that I have been able to do so. So the difficulty is that the moral story, what is the moral story? The idea of a young man selling his soul in exchange for eternal youth. There is something moral about this. The young man should not sell his soul in exchange for eternal youth. This decision is an immoral decision. It's an immoral choice. And it will have consequences which would be bad for the young man. This is a moral story. However, Oscar Wilde felt that the new thing and the valuable thing and the reason readers would want to buy and read his novel would be to reframe this moral story in a new aesthetic form. And he still feels that while the moral is there, it has not been properly subordinated to an aesthetic form. This is the problem. The problem, Oscar Wilde feels, is not that the moral is not subordinated. Remember, this is the problem that reviewers felt to be in the novel. Reviewers felt that the morality of the novel was not very clearly emphasized, that it was still possible to misread the novel as celebrating or glorifying immoral activities. While defending his novel, Oscar Wilde is still not saying that the immoral activities should be condemned. Instead, he's simply saying that the immorality was not properly subordinated to the aesthetic frame, right? So Oscar Wilde is not accepting any of the harsh criticisms. In fact, he's not even properly defending himself. In a way, he is encouraging these negative reviewers by not correcting their key complaint. And he is deflecting. He is saying that even these negative reviewers have failed to understand what the novel is trying to do. If they would only ask the right questions, if they would only judge the novel in the way it is asking to be judged, then they would be better readers. And finally, to the Scots Observer, the newspaper or the periodical which had made these very wild allegations about immorality and the sexuality of Dorian Gray as well as implying that there was a connection between Oscar Wilde and the kind of scandals that had recently erupted in late Victorian England. According to Oscar Wilde, the Scots Observer had committed the unpardonable crime of trying to confuse the artist with his subject matter. Now, of course, this statement can be applied in more than one sense. The artist refers to both Oscar Wilde, and the subject matter refers to the picture of Dorian Gray, the novel. But also, the artist and his subject matter, this phrase also refers to characters and fictional artifacts within the world of the novel. Basil Hallward is the artist, the picture of Dorian Gray is his subject matter. In Wilde's view, the best artists were not moralists who established distinctions between virtue and vice. And artists, and this is Oscar Wilde writing to the editor of the Scots Observer, an artist, sir, has no ethical sympathies at all. He sought to keep the atmosphere vague and indeterminate. That is, Oscar Wilde argues that he chose to keep the atmosphere vague and indeterminate. He chose not to pronounce a clear moral judgment, even though it was possible to misread or misinterpret what exactly was immoral about Dorian Gray's actions. That refusal to condemn Dorian Gray's action was deliberate. It was an artistic choice. And Oscar Wilde argues that such indeterminacy ensured that his readers had to play an active role in construing what Dorian Gray's sins might be. And this is Oscar Wilde again. Each man sees his own sin in Dorian Gray. What Dorian Gray's sins are, no one knows. He who finds them has brought them. Wilde therefore hinted that it was not the picture of Dorian Gray, the novel, that revelled in depravation, but the hypothetical reviewer who imagined it. Again, Wilde was not doing himself any favors. He was not saying what the reviewers wanted him to say. He was not saying what the reviewers wanted the novel to do. He was not pronouncing a clear moral indictment on sexuality or homosexuality. And this is exactly what the problem was. So you could say that Oscar Wilde's defenses were not really doing the novel any favors. As a result, the Scots Observer was able to ensure that the novel was pulled out of circulation. That is, the British distributors of the Lippincott Monthly magazine decided to stop circulating copies of the magazine, of that issue, the issue which contained the novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, following these kind of accusations and moralistic criticisms. However, given that the magazine version was no longer in circulation, Wilde, along with the British publishers, Ward, Lock & Co., who were distributing the magazine, decided to publish a book version of the same novel. For this version, which was ready about 6 months later, Oscar Wilde expanded the novel that was published in the magazine and also made some subtle changes. Okay? For instance, in the 1890 magazine version, the novel describes Basil Hallward voicing a very intimate and personal passion for Dorian. In the 1890 version, we see Dorian Gray says this about Basil Hallward. As a rule, he is charming to me and we walk home together from the club arm in arm, or sit in the studio and talk of 1,000 things. This description of these two young men walking arm in together from the club is removed entirely from the 1891 version. So you could see some evidence of Oscar Wilde giving into the kind of criticism that was made by the reviewers. Oscar Wilde was removing descriptions of friendship or intimacy between men. Further, Oscar Wilde also published a preface to Dorian Gray, a short 1 to 2 page prose piece in a magazine titled The Fortnightly Review. This was a liberal-minded journal which was edited by Wilde's friend Frank Harris. This 1 to 2 page document contained a lot of pithy, stylish, and philosophical declarations. These statements, one can see, directly, in some cases, copied from the letters that Oscar Wilde had written to these magazines, which had initially reviewed his novel. And these sentences are then expanded and then added to the preface. For instance, the preface to Dorian Gray has this statement: no artist has ethical sympathies. An ethical sympathy in an artist is an unpardonable mannerism of style. Vice and virtue are to the artist materials for an art. Further, there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. You can see that these lines directly speak and articulate the kind of intellectual difference Oscar Wilde had faced and had argued was the case between the kind of novel the reviewers were expecting and the kind of novel that he had written. Wilde writes, "My preface should teach them to mend their wicked ways." That is, he hoped that once this preface was published, reviewers would know what would be the right way to receive, read, evaluate, and interpret this novel. However, this kind of re-education of the reviewers did not happen, and the book, when it was published, also received unfavorable reviews. The one positive review that it did receive was from Walter Pater. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, Walter Pater is an extremely important figure for Oscar Wilde, for The Picture of Dorian Gray, the novel, and also for the Victorian period in general. Walter Pater was known for an 1873 publication which was titled Studies in the History of the Renaissance. Popularly and more colloquially, this book was also known simply as The Renaissance. This was published in the year 1873 and was modified in the year 1877 with some deletions. The reason for these modifications and deletions was that one section of the book, which is titled The Conclusion, contained some descriptions and some sentences which made many sections of the Victorian reading public extremely uneasy. Right? This conclusion to Walter Pater's Studies in the History of the Renaissance spoke about the pursuit of sensual pleasures in a way that troubled many readers and reviewers. Some sentences from this conclusion, if I quote them, will help explain the point. Walter Pater writes, "Not the fruit of experience, but experience itself is the end. A counted number of pulses only is given to us of a variegated dramatic life. How may we see in them all that is to be seen in them by the finest senses?" So this sentence clearly focuses on pleasure, on the pursuit of the happiness that aesthetic pleasure can produce, and even isolates the fruit of experience from the experience itself. So one should pursue experience not for what it can teach one, or not for how it can change one, but for simply the act itself. And this kind of a language, you can see, flies in the face of most Victorian morality, which comes from a religious idea of condemning all physical, bodily, or sexual or sensual pleasures. In advancing the view that we should live for the moment, enjoying any stirring of the senses, Pater laid himself open to the charge that he celebrated hedonism. Hedonism is a pursuit of pleasure at any cost, even if it challenges the prevailing morality and the legality of the time. Faced with such accusations in 1877, Pater deleted that conclusion from the second edition of his book. Now, we can sense that many characters and even the narrator of Oscar Wilde's novel Picture of Dorian Gray echo views from Pater's work. Now, the character who seems to echo the views of Walter Pater most powerfully is the character Lord Henry. As I mentioned in my previous lectures, Lord Henry is an aesthete. He's a privileged dandy. He approaches Dorian Gray not with any sincere emotion, but as a kind of social, intellectual experiment. Lord Henry wishes to draw pleasure from observing how Dorian Gray reacts when he is exposed to radical, revolutionary ideas about the pursuit of pleasure, and so on. So this character, the language that Lord Henry uses to justify the pursuit of pleasure, to encourage Dorian to do certain things, to encourage Dorian to mistreat Sybil Vane, for instance, to encourage Dorian to become the kind of hedonist that he does become. That language echoes the language that was used by Walter Pater in his book, Studies in the History of the Renaissance. More specifically, there are more intertextual connections between the language that Lord Henry uses and Pater's work. Pater's essay, Two Early French Stories, also provide the language with which Lord Henry encourages the education and, in fact, also, to be frank, the corruption of Dorian Gray. Pater's essay, Two Early French Stories, examines how the lingering paganism of the medieval Renaissance impelled people beyond the bounds of the Christian ideal, and their love became sometimes a strange idolatry, a strange rival religion. Therefore, Christianity imposes morality, whereas it is possible to retrieve from the Renaissance ideas of a pre-Christian, anti-moral, anti-Christian idea of aesthetics, which can inspire behavior in people, which can go beyond the bounds of Christianity, which can encourage the possibility of imagining and practicing a kind of love which becomes a strange kind of idolatry, a rival religion. This is a very radical idea, and this is exactly what Dorian practices. Although Dorian does not have a sense of where this will lead him and how tragic and painful will be the consequences of following such an ideology. Additionally, Lord Henry also echoes other writings by Walter Pater. He appears to endorse Pater's study of the German art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann, whose affinity with Hellenism was not merely intellectual, because subtler threads of temperament were inwoven in it, as is proved by his romantic, fervent friendships with young men. These are Pater's words. Pater describes this German art historian whose affinity to Hellenism is not merely intellectual. That is, he did not merely study Hellenism, the classical Greek period in which the best art and culture of modern civilization was written and produced, but he also practiced something that Hellenism did not only write about or produce, but practice in terms of its relationships between men. Hellenism was known for pederastia, or a kind of friendship which also included sexuality between older, more expert, knowledgeable men and younger men who were taken on as apprentices or students. So this German historian Winckelmann is valued as an important Hellenist because he practiced both pederastia and the kind of ideology and intellectual work of the classical Greek period. These reverberations of Pater's writings were potentially polemical because, as these quotations demonstrate, they elevate pagan sensuality over Christian asceticism, just as they suggest that the genuine love of ancient Greek art emerged from a homoerotic sensibility. This is a little bit of background to Walter Pater and the kind of influence that Walter Pater had on the intellectual culture of late Victorian England. The writer of these documents, Walter Pater, reviewed the 1891 book version of The Picture of Dorian Gray and found many things to praise in this novel. There's one thing, however, about which Walter Pater remained a little bit confused. Walter Pater praised everything, but stumbled when he thought and reflected on Lord Henry. And this is the character whose views seem to echo most directly the kind of ideas that Walter Pater had published, but then eventually also retracted to some extent because of the kind of controversy they produced, because of their connection between sexuality, morality, and religion. It was not entirely obvious to Pater if Wilde intended Lord Henry as a satiric sketch. That is, Walter Pater felt that maybe Oscar Wilde was making fun of a certain kind of individual, a certain type of thinking, a certain way of thinking in the character of Lord Henry. It was possible that that was the case because Lord Henry seems exaggerated. He seems to say certain things that he has heard, that he might have heard in a lecture or might have read in a book that Walter Pater might have authored, But in the manner in which Lord Henry articulates these ideas, they seem very anti intellectual and they seem very irresponsible. So, this is the difference between what Walter Pater wrote about and argued in his scholarly writings and the version of those ideas that we find articulated by Lord Henry. Lord Henry's is much more irresponsible, much more trivial, much more frivolous, whereas Walter Pater's is much more philosophical and serious. So Walter Pater was naturally confused, and he wrote in his review, the young lord is not supposed to figure the motive and tendency of a true Epicurean doctrine of life. So this remains the mystery even today. To what extent is Oscar Wilde advocating the kind of Hellenism, the kind of aesthetic ideas, the kind of ideas of beauty and aesthetics which naturalize or give a certain kind of justification to homoeroticism, to same sex intimacy, and to the kind of illegality and immorality for which Oscar Wilde would ultimately be attacked. So these are some questions that the novel opens for us, not necessarily to answer, but because these questions reveal something very fundamental about hypocrisies, about the anxieties, about the desires and the ambitions, and essentially the realities of late Victorian England. And what are these questions? Is the narrator really mocking this character? Is Wilde mocking Lord Henry? If so, is Wilde mocking Henry in order to demonstrate what is the right and the wrong way to practice Hellenism? So Walter Pater's Hellenism would be the right way to practice Hellenism, whereas Lord Henry's would be the wrong way. So this is the morality tale, that if Hellenism or aestheticism is misinterpreted and is taken merely as a pursuit of pleasure, it can lead to tragic consequences. Further, the novel also questions if we are supposed to view Lord Henry's musings as empty cynicism when their sources come mostly from Pater and Wilde. So essentially, what is the difference between this non-serious, frivolous deployment of Hellenism and the serious philosophical sources from which this Hellenism comes? We will reflect on the consequences of this aesthetic philosophy for Oscar Wilde's life and career, and also transition from this novel, that is The Picture of Dorian Gray, to another novel, which is Dracula by Bram Stoker, in the next lecture. Thank you.